Welcome to the Outer Realm with Michelle DeRoche and Amelia Pisano. Airing live on the United Public Radio Network, 105.3 FM in New Orleans.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Thursday night edition of The Outer Realm. We are broadcasting live here on United Public Radio Network 105.3 FM from the beautiful city of New Orleans. Tonight, of course, we are sponsored Folgers Coffee, and every night they are responsible for the content that you are receiving. I might have a little part, and they are basically there. They have been there since day one, and we're so grateful for them. So thank you, Folgers. We really do appreciate you more than you know. Also, truly honored and grateful to Dr. Snick, a.k.a. Justin Snicker, the Sonic Surgeon, for his award-winning intro and outro. He is a composer of Halloween, horror, sci-fi, and dark wave electronic music, which can be found on any platform that has good music. So thank you, thank you, thank you. You will notice, of course, that my bubbly little companion is not with me again tonight. Not the same without her, let me tell you. I like seeing that little bubbly voice, hearing that bubbly voice, and seeing that little bubbly face, but she's not feeling very bubbly lately. She's still down with certain, let's just say, pandemic has hit her, and it's not going away anytime soon. So anyway, let's send her lots of love and light and hope that she can get herself all straightened out, because we certainly do miss her. I see chat is starting to fill up. Wayne, Tamara, Mike, Walker, hello. I know. Tamara says hi. Poor Bubbles. I know. It's just not the same. So love and light from everyone. Thanks, Mike. And yeah, hopefully, she'll be back at it next week. Otherwise, we're going to have to go beat that bloody thing out of her. So anyway, to everybody who has joined the new project pages, Team Templar North America, thank you. It's definitely something that's near and dear, to us. And again, a bit of a lineage thing. I'm a history buff, so this is really exciting. This is a project that is going to change history with some amazing people on board. So if you haven't joined it yet, maybe just consider going on over. Again, Team Templar North America. I sent out some invites, but there's something on my private page as well, just because sometimes, social media gets a little funky with how many you can send out, and they don't always let you see them either, which is a bit of a pain in the rump. But anyway, lots of good things coming, and I can assure you, because I've been made privy to some of it, and all I can say is, holy cow, it's going to be phenomenal. And speaking of phenomenal, tonight's also going to be phenomenal. We welcome, for the very first time, Kevin Randle to the show. He's an author of over 100 books. My gosh, 100 books. He's a retired lieutenant colonel of the United States Air Force, has a PhD in psychology, and he's going to be discussing his new book, which basically are UFO sighting and events around Levelland, Texas. And that's the new book. So it's basically going to be super exciting. He just basically figures not enough was done, and he's going to be talking about some of this this evening. Hey, Tyler. So to get into the action, people, you have to get on one of our many platforms. So tonight we are on, let's start with YouTube. Mine, which is just under Michelle DeRoche at the Outer Realm, which is really an archive page. So go check it out. Everything's all in one spot if you need it. UFO Paranormal, that's also YouTube. That's the network's main page. UFO Gods and Extraterrestrials tonight. Heading over to Facebook, we have news on the flip side. We have UFO Paranormal Radio / United Public Radio, Canada's Most Haunted, again, Joe Montaldo, UFO Undercover as well. So just check out one of those places and, be able to see your comments come up. We'll put them up, so Kevin may see them. And we're just waiting for him to come in. So a little bit about the author. Basically, he's a prominent ufologist within the UFO community, often regarded as one of the preeminent experts on the reported crash of a UFO near Roswell, New Mexico in July of 1947. He's a professional best-selling author with over 100 books to his name, has a PhD in psychology, was in the United States Air Force and National Guard, where he held rank of lieutenant colonel before retiring in 2009. The book basically goes back on November 2nd, 1957, the series of sightings of glowing egg-shaped object was seen around the West Texas town of Levelland, USA. Multiple witnesses. Oh, and here he is. Well, we'll let him tell you himself. Hello.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm fine, and you?
I'm much better now.
So. You're looking somewhat gothic.
Oh, thank you. The whole house is like this, actually. So I know it's just, my little piece of heaven, but I'm like glad to share it with everybody. It also helps with the sound. It doesn't sound like I'm in a tin box. We came from a radio station and everything just seemed to echo. So it's like, I think the house might be better. It's got 3-foot thick walls, and that's bound to get me some buffering.
I would think so.
Yeah, fingers crossed. So how are you?
I'm fine. My
Great.
eyes water all the time, so be aware.
Oh, that's okay. That's okay. I'm just so honored that you're here to join us. And Philip has spoken so highly of you. And 100 books. My God.
I actually stopped counting at 125.
Oh, well, I would say, are these all on UFOs? Is this all?
No.
Oh, okay.
There's a lot. There's science fiction and action adventure and historical fiction, and
wow.
I even did a murder mystery once.
Wow. So you're just all over the place. You just got something for everyone, basically.
I started out writing about UFOs, but my goal had always been to write science fiction.
Right.
And I hooked up with a fellow named Bob Cornett, who also had a desire to write science fiction. And we started going to science fiction conventions to meet the editors. The editors attend science fiction conventions. We thought, well, if we meet the editors and they know what we look like and who we are, they might be more inclined to buy a book.
Right.
And it actually worked out for us. Although what happened is we met an agent who knew of my military background and called one day and said, could you write books about the Green Berets in Vietnam? And I said, sure. If she'd called and said, can you write books about nurses in hospitals? I would have said, sure. So we started out Bob and I started doing action adventure books about the Green Berets in Vietnam, but we were also writing science fiction on the side, and eventually sold some of those. And I had done UFO articles while I was in college to kind of pay the tuition.
Right.
And so I did a collection of those articles in a book called the UFO Case Book in 1989 and got invited to participate in the QFOS investigation of the Roswell case. And from there, the UFO thing kind of exploded. And I've done about 30 books on UFOs.
Right. So, yeah, I think it's still something that's just never died. I think people's curiosity. Now, of course, we can talk about it more than we could talk about it back then. They weren't as open about it. But before we move on, here we go. There we go, Tyler. Hello, sir. How may I get your books? I like that. That's very proper, Tyler.
Yes, thank you. Amazon, of course.
There we go. So just, get over to Amazon. Kevin Randle.
Good deals on the UFO books on Amazon. For if you have a Kindle reader, you can get them now.
Right. Chop. Let's
and
go.
if not, there's paperback editions or what they call trade paperback editions of most of the books, and some of them are in hardback as well. So you just have to kind of search around. Just type my name into Amazon, and everything will come up.
There we go. So now we're going to get into the meat and potatoes of everything. And before we do that, I do want to take the time to thank you so much for your service.
Oh, thank you.
my goodness, to retire as lieutenant colonel was just like a big wow. And
Well,
gosh,
I could have done better if I hadn't started out as an enlisted soldier.
right, right. I think you did okay. You just full on with everything. My gosh, I mean, you have a degree in psychology. Where'd you find the time to do that? When you're writing 125 books and in service.
Well, a lot of the books were written on a computer, so that's
Right.
sped things up.
Right. Well, there we go. So let's get the show on the road. Where would you like to start with this journey? Obviously UFOs, you were writing this in college, and this is something that just grew, and you became an authority on Roswell. And were you writing anything else based on experiences before that, or did it really start with Roswell?
The action adventure books started out kind of based on my experiences in Vietnam.
Right.
I drew a lot of that, put in the books a lot of that information, which helped underscore the reality of the books. I mean, it was written by somebody who was there, and I could describe the places as they actually existed, not as you saw them on the news or read about them in another book.
Right.
The UFO stuff had always interested me, and I had been studying UFOs since basically I was in high school, and I just wanted to write books, or write stories about them. And there was, in the 1970s, when I was going to college, there was 6 or 7 magazines that dealt with UFOs, from Argosie's UFO, Truths, Flying Saucers and UFOs, and Saga Magazine and Saga's UFO Report, Official UFO. And so I could make enough money writing these articles to pay my tuition. So I always say I went to the University of Iowa on my Saga scholarship, which meant I would write a article that would appear in the UFO Report, and they would pay me, and it was $10 short of paying my tuition for that semester. So I had to write some other stuff.
So close. Right.
But it's always been an interest, and I always wanted to write about that. When I had been, like I said, I've been going to science fiction conventions, and I was at a science fiction convention in Milwaukee, and it was going to be 3 science fiction writers arguing UFOs with 2 guys from the Center for UFO Studies. And I was going to be with the science fiction writers. I think one of them was actually George R.R. Martin before he became George R.R. Martin.
Wow.
The other one was Frederick Pohl. So I was in very good company there.
Right.
When the guy showed up from Kufos, there was only one guy, Don Schmidt. And I thought, well, it's not fair 3 of us ganging up on him. And it's a debate. So I switched sides and debated the reality of UFOs with Don Schmidt. Well, not long after that, I got a call from the Center for UFO Studies and said they were going to reopen the Roswell investigation because there were many witnesses who had not been interviewed. Right. There was a lot of additional work to be done. And since I had a military background, that would be valuable, talking to these people who were in the military at the time of the UFO event. Many of them were retired military, and I could relate to them better than a civilian. I would understand the lingo. And one of the examples of that, in the first book on Roswell, they described Colonel Thomas DuBose as General Ramey's aide. And I knew that a brigadier general does not have a full colonel as an aide. The chief of staff of the Air Force or the Army would have a full colonel as an aide, but a brigadier general would have a first lieutenant or a captain in his aide. So I knew DuBose was not his aide, and discovered he was the chief of staff of the 8th Air Force, which is a much more prestigious and higher position than the aide to the commanding general. Wow. So that was the kind of expertise I brought to it. So they invited me to their investigation, and Don and I went down to Roswell thinking we were going to solve this thing immediately, that clearly there was some terrestrial explanation. And of course, it had come out in the 1940s, late 1947, that it was a weather balloon or some kind of misidentified weather observation device. And we thought that's going to be it. We hadn't really looked at the Roswell incident because we didn't want to contaminate our investigation with that information. We wanted to come into it clean because we knew who to talk to and that sort of thing. We spent several days down there. We talked to a number of people. Didn't go very well. We were supposed to meet Frank Joyce, who was a reporter in 1947 at one of the stations in Roswell, and had a story to tell, but he called and begged off. He was sick that that weekend we were there, and we met with a group of people who were not really UFO oriented. They were more New Age oriented. So that wasn't helpful at all.
Right.
We met with Cliff Stone, who said about lecturing us on UFOs. We really didn't need a lecture from Cliff Stone.
Right.
And we figured this is just, this is bogus. There's nothing going on. Then we met Bill Brazel, son of Mac Brazel. We sat down with him and we talked to him for an hour and 15 minutes, hour and 30 minutes. Have it all on tape, by the way.
Nice.
And, turned the whole thing around. So as we were going back to Albuquerque to catch our planes to come home, I said to Don, we've got to come back. We haven't gotten very far. And then in the next trip, we were able to meet with the daughters of the sheriff, George Wilcox. We were able to meet with a number of other people, Walter Hott, and we're gathering more and more information. We hadn't really changed our mind. We still thought there was going to be a terrestrial explanation, but we were talking to an awful lot of people who were directly involved. Walter Hott, of course, wrote the press release. One of the daughters, Phyllis McGuire, was actually in the sheriff's office when Mac Brazel showed up to tell him about what he had found in his field and a sample of the debris. So we're talking to people who are now directly involved. And of course, we met again with Bill Brazel, which is kind of funny. He was going to take us out and show us where the thing had crashed. We're going to go out to the actual debris field. People have said, well, you guys don't really know where it is. And I'm thinking, yeah, Bill Brazel took us out there and said, this is where I found it.
Wow.
So pretty sure that we were there.
Right.
But we're driving across country in this pickup truck. It's 8 o'clock in the morning. And Bill says to Don and me, you boys want a beer? And
that's when the good stuff happens.
Don is pretty much a teetotaler. And I'm thinking, well, if Bill Brazel is going to have a beer, one of us better have a beer with him.
That's right.
One of my favorite drinks at breakfast is warm beer.
Right.
But so I had a beer and he took us out there. He told us what he had seen and what had happened from that point of view. And we met a number of other people. So we had to keep scheduling trips to come down because we were gathering more and more data and we were getting more and more leads and more people to talk to. On our second trip, we met with Frank Joyce. He was feeling better and we met with him in Albuquerque and had a nice discussion with him. And I mean, he was there and received the press release from Walter Hott. For some reason, I kept on saying Bill Brazel from Walter Hott. And what was interesting is Walter apparently I think he phoned it to the news media in Roswell, the 2 radio stations, the 2 newspaper. He said, well, he took it around to each of the people, and other times he said he phoned it to them. And I think he phoned it because there's discrepancies between the press release that George Walsh had sent off over his wire and the press release that Frank Joyce sent out over his wire. There's discrepancies in it. So it seems to be that it's he dictated it over the phone and they were scribbling it down quickly. And so there are differences that are just really irrelevant, but there are differences. But the point simply is they put it on the wire. I mean, we're talking to guys who put it on the wire. We're talking to guys who interviewed Mac Brazel back in 1947, and we're getting more and more data. And it suddenly became clear to us that it's not going to be explainable by a weather balloon. We went to White Sands and talked to them about what they were launching at the time because they were firing missiles and rockets. And for those of you who don't know, a missile has a guidance system and a rocket doesn't. Just a little bit of trivia we picked up at White Sands, talking to the people there about what they did. And they had a complete record of all their launches of rockets and missiles in 1947. And they gave us a copy of that. There was nothing missing, so it wasn't that. We talked to a possibility of experimental aircraft that had crashed. We talked about all kinds of things. The Air Force finally did the ultimate investigation for us in that respect in 1995 when they did their report on Roswell. They wrote in their big, thick book that they had eliminated the possibility of an aircraft accident, both civilian and military or experimental. They eliminated all kinds of things, which we had already done, but they verified that. So they're left with only one thing, which was Project Mogul, this balloon array. And we'd pretty well eliminated that ourselves prior to that. So it became clear to us that there was no terrestrial explanation. I talked to Edwin Easley. He was a retired colonel. He'd been the provost marshal in Roswell in 1947, the provost marshal being like the chief of police. military police. And he talked to me. I don't think he ever talked to anybody else. And I think he talked to me mainly because I was calling him on the phone and asking him questions.
Right.
And Don wasn't bothering him. And easily had gotten a package of material from Stan Friedman and just wanted nothing to do with Stan Friedman. So
wow.
he was talking to me, and I asked him at one point, are we following the right path? And he says, what do you mean? I said, well, we think it's extraterrestrial. And he said, well, let me put it this way. It's not the wrong path. But he also told me repeatedly he couldn't talk about it because he was sworn to secrecy. He would tell us what he thought he could tell us without violating that oath. So I found him as a very credible witness. And I just had a book published called Understanding Roswell. And in that book, I detailed the entire senior staff in Roswell and what they were doing and who they are, and what happened to them.
Wow.
So we talked to everybody who was still alive at the time about this. So we had come to the conclusion there really is no terrestrial explanation. In the early 1990s, the case was much more robust than it is today. And I say that because we were talking to a guy named Frank Kaufman, who was giving us what he alleged to be inside information about the case. Mm. And it was fascinating stuff. Unfortunately, he was making it all up. And so we had to eliminate that testimony, and that harmed the case because here was one of the alleged firsthand witnesses to the craft and the bodies, who didn't see the craft nor the bodies and was not involved at all. So
that's hard.
But the real point is we were the ones that exposed him. I mean, the skeptics and the debunkers said, well, you can't believe Frank Kaufman. And we'd say, why? Well, you just came about from, there can't be alien visitation, ergo what he's telling you has to be a lie. Mm-hmm. We actually proved it was a lie. So we were able to eliminate his testimony that way. So, the case was not as robust as it was then because of some of the witnesses we've had to eliminate. Mm-hmm. The other problem is almost everybody that I can think of who would have been there in 1947 has since died. We've lost everybody. Wow. Right. We're talking guys who would be in their 90s or older now. Mm-hmm. to talk to them, because it was 75 years ago, and you've got to figure that the people at Roswell involved in this would have been at over 20. Mm-hmm. So we're looking at 95, 96 years old. I talked to one guy who was 89. I talked to him about 10, 12 years ago, who didn't have a lot of information, but the one thing he said to me was critical. He says, well, we were told not to talk about it, just forget it ever happened. So I think it's one of these guys who and please, for those of you who do body language, I scratched my nose not because I'm lying. I scratched my nose because it itched.
That's right. Same.
Just so you know.
Right.
I know you're not supposed to touch your face in these events, but I did that anyway.
I'd be in trouble. I'm always at it.
but the point simply is, I talked to one guy who was 96 years old when I interviewed him.
Right.
A guy named Curry Holden. His first name was William, and so he always went by W. Curry Holden for the obvious reason. For those of you who don't know, there was a big actor named William Holden.
Maybe it's true.
In the 1950s.
I'm aging myself now.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think my hair gives me away, so there you go. But I talked to him at 96. I was very careful when I talked to him because I understood that, as we've seen recently, that those people in their older years are sometimes easily confused and go off on tangents. And I really hesitate to talk about that because I'm reaching that point myself.
Right.
But Holden said that he was there and he saw it all. And I had a preliminary conversation with him. He was 96. His goal was to live to be 100. I think he died within 3 months of me having interviewed him. Had plenty to go back. Now his daughter, Jane Holden, I forget what her married name is. Mark Rodiger from the center interviewed her, and she said, well, my father become easily confused in his later years, and you had to be careful with that. I was aware of that problem, and I tried to ask the questions without leading them, very generic questions. So we had to look at all that. I think that we've been careful in that, but the real point is as we got deeper into this and talked to those people, a lot of it we have on tape, audio tape, more of it we have on videotape. This was before we were doing everything digitally and had cell phones. For those of you who don't remember, you used to have to pay long distance charges. And my phone bills were ridiculous.
Yeah.
Calling people long distance. Now you call around the world for free practically, and you can record the conversation on your phone. And I've done that more than once.
Right.
Or you can talk to the people face to face.
That's right.
Can you use Skype? Just type Skype into your search engine and log on, and we'll talk.
Like what? What's a search engine? No. Some people get very confused with that.
We know what that is.
Yes.
But in talking to the people, people would say, "Have you talked to Sheridan Cavett?" He went with Marcel out to the debris field with Mac Brazel that first day in Roswell. And for the longest time, I said, "No, I haven't talked to him. I haven't called him. I want to meet him in person." And they said, "Why?" And I said, "I want to watch his body language, and I want to be there so I can see his reactions." So we finally caught up with him in Arizona, right outside Fort Huachuca, which is the big Army's intelligence center. Cavett had been a counterintelligence guy at Roswell in 1947 and trained, I guess, at Hullaburg, which is on the East Coast. But they were wintering in Sierra Vista, Arizona, which is outside the gate of Fort Huachuca, because as retired military, he could use the facilities. I know this because as retired military, I can use the facilities on the bases. But so we did see him and met him there in Sierra Vista, and he nice fellow, and we talked to him again in his home in Sequim, Washington. But what I'm getting at here is the reason I wanted to talk to him in person. There's only one point where that was actually valuable. And we were talking about the crash and the bodies. And I said something about the bodies. And he said he got very nervous when I brought that up. And he leaned forward. He picked the magazine up off the coffee table. He threw it back down. He says, "Bill Rickett tell you that?" Bill Rickett being the NCOIC of the counterintelligence officer, worked directly under Cavett. And I, to protect Bill Rickett, said, "No, we got it from Edwin Easley." And he relaxed immediately. And I know I'd blown the interview at that point, but I also got to watch his reaction. So we saw his nervousness as we broached the topic of the bodies and the debris field. We'd asked him before, we talked to him before about that. And he said, "Well, Jesse Marcel described the guy that went with him as a good West Texas boy, could ride a horse." And Cavett said, "Well, that pretty well describes me." And so he confirmed he wouldn't really tell us he was there. He kept beating around the bush. He told us originally that he hadn't been assigned to Roswell. Then he'd been assigned to Roswell at the time, but he hadn't made it. And then he'd been there, got there early in July of 1947. When Colonel Weaver, who was the Air Force investigator that did it in 1995, sat down with Cavett, he said, "Yeah, I was there." And he told him all this stuff. We met with Cavett a month later after this interview, and we know the details of when Weaver talked to him because it's in their big report and it gives the date and all of that information. And in fact, Mary Cavett, his wife, says, "Did you tell him about the colonel that came to see you?" And he didn't really want to tell us about the colonel that come to see him. So we were there a month later, and he still denied he'd been there, even though he had already told Weaver that he had been, and he had been involved, and he'd gone out to the debris field. And it's critical because he said, "When I got out there, I recognized it immediately as a weather balloon." And I'm thinking the next question should have been, "Did you tell Jesse Marcel this rather important piece of intelligence?" But the next question went off in a different direction. Well, the reason this is important, because as I was working on Understanding Roswell, the book, I realized that Mac Brazel on that first day brought samples of the debris to the sheriff's office. Phyllis McGuire, the daughter of the sheriff that I'd mentioned earlier, had been in the office, and she saw the debris when it was brought in. She knows what it looked like. But the real point is she saw the debris brought into the office. So now we have Marcel coming out to the sheriff's office, seeing the debris, being confused by it, going back and telling his commander Blanchard what was going on. And Blanchard said, "Well, go on out there and see what's happened and take the new guy," meaning Cavett. Right. So then they both go to the sheriff's office to meet with Brazel. So now Cavett's seen the debris. But when he gets out to the debris field, he's saying, "Well, I recognize it immediately as a balloon." I'm thinking, why didn't you recognize it in the sheriff's office and negate this whole fiasco that we've now involved ourselves in? I've been involved in that since 1989, investigating the Roswell.
Should they not have been over that? Like, is there still a fear that somebody's going to come after them? Or, I mean, why switch it up now? Why not just come out with it already?
I like to promote my books. So here we go.
Okay.
Absolutely. I did a book called UFOs in the Deep State. And people had asked me that question many times. I said, I just don't know why they continue to do it. But as I looked into it in relation to the deep state, I realized it's all about power and it's all about money.
Yeah.
And I think the fear of the people who control the information is that if the information comes out and they say, yes, it's all true, then they lose some of their power and it might impact their finances. So they're protecting their power, the power structure. And in the book, I talked to a lawyer who had investigated part of the Roswell, not the Roswell, but UFO crashes for Jimmy Carter. When Carter, if you remember, and if you didn't, you might have read about it because you look like you're too young to remember Jimmy Carter.
Right. Not me. I remember him.
But he had one of his campaign promises was he was going to get to the bottom of this UFO thing, and he never did. And I was talking to the lawyer about this, and Jimmy Carter. He said, "Well, President Carter told him the story that when he was setting up his cabinet and doing all that work as the president-elect, he met with George H.W. Bush, who was the director of Central Intelligence at the time. And Bush said to Carter, I would like to remain on as the director of Central Intelligence. And Carter says, I've got my own guy coming in. So you're going to have to find another job, which is not unusual. I mean, the president comes in and that's his prerogative to get rid of those political appointees and kind of lay waste to the landscape and bring in his own people. So, I mean, it's nothing that Carter did that was egregious. They all have done that to a certain extent. But then Carter says, well, I want you to tell me about the UFOs, everything you can about UFOs. And Bush's response is, you're not cleared to hear that, and you're not the president yet, so I'm not going to tell you. Wow. Now, I had always said, if I was a president and I asked the director of Central Intelligence, tell me about UFOs, and he said, well, you're not cleared for that. My next sentence would have been, you're fired, bring in your deputy, and to get to the bottom of it. But now we have an instance, not quite analogous to what that situation is, but somewhat analogous. And the director of Central Intelligence is telling the president-elect, you're not clear to hear that yet. You're not the president yet. So when you become the president, now you ask the questions. And I think what happens at that point, and we saw some of this just recently, you go to your director of Central Intelligence, whoever it is, and says, Mr. Director, I want everything you have on UFOs. And the director of Central Intelligence, very complex question, and that information is spread out in a number of different governmental agencies. To get you a proper briefing on this, we're going to take some time and gather all that information. Somehow that information never gets gathered. Somehow there always a crisis shows up or something comes to direct the president's attention and it doesn't get done. And what I say, we've seen that. We had Congress mandating that the director of national intelligence produce a report on UFOs based on the Navy's cockpit videos and that investigation at 180 days from the passage of that legislation or the creation of that committee. 180 days was June 25th, 2021. What happened? We got a 9-page report. And I think what happened is everybody just figured nobody's going to remember this. And the news media, about 3 or 4 weeks before it came out, everybody started talking about this report coming out. And they said, we've got to come up with something. And they came up with this report that I've always graded as a C- high school report on UFOs. And so they said, well, we're going to come back in 90 days with a more comprehensive report. Well, that would have been October 25th of last year. And we haven't heard anything since then.
Right.
and I think that we got to gather the information gambit in play. We don't have it yet. We'll get it for you. And now we find ourselves in a situation where there's any number of crises that are going to divert the president's attention. Although there is absolutely no indication that President Biden has any interest in UFOs.
Right.
There's no indication that President Trump had any interest in UFOs, so they didn't have to worry about that. President Carter did, not Carter, but Clinton did. But I think we see the world situation has diverted attention. Mm-hmm. Congress passed their bill that says they're going to create a new office to look at UFOs and fund it and all of this stuff. And I'm thinking this is Twining 2.0. Mm-hmm. What I mean by that is back in 1947, Lieutenant General Nathan Twining was the head of the Air Materiel Command. He was a commanding officer. And when the UFO situation manifested itself after Kenneth Arnold made a big deal out of it, or the news media or whoever did, there was a report called The Estimate of the Situation. And what it was an intelligence analysis. Here's a whole bunch of inexplicable reports. And it was sent to General Twining at the Air Materiel Command because he had all the intelligence function under his direct authority there at Air Materiel Command. Not all of it, but he had a lot of it there. And so they reviewed that material. And on September 23rd, I believe it was, 1947, they issued a letter signed by Twining. I think it was probably written by Colonel Howard McCoy. But at one point it says the phenomenon is nothing illusionary or fictitious. It's something real. Mm-hmm. And we're going to set up an office to investigate. And it's going to have a priority of a 2A priority, and it's going to have a classification. The name is going to be classified, which was Project Sign. And the name, if you go back and look at the newspapers and the magazine articles from the time, they talk about Project Saucer. That was the public name of this office.
Right.
But that's where we are today. We're 75 years down the road, and now we're setting up a new office to investigate UFOs.
Which we've always known was there.
Well, I mean, it's the same thing.
Right.
They're not looking at the history of the phenomenon, which they should be doing. Right. There's an awful lot of good cases that should have been reviewed properly. They're going to talk about the Condon Committee, which was the University of Colorado study that was commissioned in 1967 at the University of Colorado. Mm-hmm. Right. Dr. Condon,
right,
for $500,000 to study UFOs. And what we know based on the documentation that's available, and a lot of this is on my blog, you just type in the Hippler letter. It's Hippler, Lieutenant Colonel Hippler, Robert Hippler. And it's the letter's laid out there, and he's writing to the Condon Committee and says, here's what we'd like you to find. There's no national security implications. The Air Force has done a good job of investigating UFOs, and there's nothing to be learned by continued study. It should be shut down. Lo and behold, 18 months later, when the Condon Committee issues their report, they say there's no national security implications, which they knew was a lie. They said the Air Force has done a good job of investigating UFOs, which they may not have known a lie. They may have known was a lie, but they believed it. And we know, because we have access to the Blue Book files, they didn't do a very good job. And nothing new could be learned except one of their reports. Mm-hmm. This always cracked me up. One of the sightings they solved by saying it was a natural phenomenon so rare it had never been seen before or since. And I'm thinking there's something of scientific significance that could be learned by studying UFOs based on your conclusion of this report. Mm-hmm. And so for the longest time, we had to put up with, well, the scientists have looked at it and there's nothing to it. Well, the scientists didn't really look at it. They did a public relations job for the Air Force. And we also know that there's many, many cases that were sent to the military that never ended up in Project Blue Book. Alan Hynek, who was a consultant to Blue Book, said repeatedly that he knew there were cases that were not going to Blue Book. He would hear things at the Blue Book office or in the intelligence arena there at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and he knew there were cases coming in, and they didn't go anywhere. And we had an example of that with the Lonnie Zamora case in 1964, April 24th, which is coming up in 3 days, anniversary of the Lonnie Zamora landing. There was another case in La Madera, which is, I think, around Santa Fe, New Mexico. It's up the interstate a ways from Socorro. It's not that far away, but it was the next night or something like that with a landing traces. Hynek wanted to go investigate that. And they said, no, you're just there to do Socorro, come home. There's another case that's getting publicity, and he's not allowed to go take a look at it.
Right.
So we know that kind of stuff went on. Yes, there's a blue book file on that case, but it's not very comprehensive. And they said they solved it because it was teenage boys burning rags in the distance.
Right.
One of the more ludicrous things. But I mean, so the point is, the reason we don't know more is, I believe it has to do with the power structure in Washington, D.C. And if you look at who goes from administration to administration, the upper level bureaucrats, not the secretaries of defense or the secretary of state, but the upper level bureaucrats who are there from administration to administration to administration, are controlling a lot of this information, and it helps them retain their power by knowing this. And if they admit that there's alien spacecraft coming to Earth, that tells us that there's a technology that is far superior to ours. And we know, based on Earth history, anytime a technologically superior civilization comes in contact with a more primitive technological society, that more primitive society ceases to exist by the mere introduction of the technology.
Right.
And we can look at with the Plains Indians. A clay pot is not nearly as good a cooking vessel as a steel pot,
Right.
or an iron pot.
Mm-hmm.
But the Plains Indians didn't have the technology to create iron. So they had to rely on our technology, the European technology, the American technology, to supply those things to them that they needed. Yes, there were tribes on the East Coast that were much more technologically advanced than those on the plains. And I think they were mining copper and other metals like that. So they had that kind of knowledge. But it turns out firearms were superior to bows and arrows, and of course, had the Spanish not introduced the horse,
Yes,
which I think radically altered the civilizations.
absolutely.
The introduction of the horse made many of the tribes much more nomadic.
Mm-hmm.
So we can see that. I think that lesson is not lost on those in the power structure. So they want to retain that power. So that's why we don't have the answers, and why I don't think disclosure is coming, much to Richard Dolan's probably annoyance. But I think it's the only way disclosure is going to happen is when the aliens land and said, here we are, and there's nothing that they can do to hide it.
The preliminary disclosure to me was just here's a little snippet for you. That's all we're giving you. Unfortunately, like I say this like constantly, everybody's usually has one of these now, and they're out getting their own. I've seen incredible images just from everyday people who are putting it out there. You can't really hide it. Melissa in chat is saying, lots of information, lots of holding back. Do you think this will change in the near future? And basically, you've answered the question by saying, unless they drop right down on the roof of the White House for everybody to see it, it's not going to happen.
Well, we have seen in the last year, what they are doing is the same thing they did 75 years ago, which suppressed the information. I think we are getting our attention diverted now. I think it's coincidental. I don't think they engineered some of the crises we are falling into.
Mm-hmm.
But we have inflation running rampant. We have gas prices going up exponentially. We have the border being flooded by people crossing illegally. We've got the war in Ukraine, all these diversions, and our government has to respond to those things, which are much more important or imperative than worrying about the possibility of aliens landing tomorrow. They haven't landed to make themselves known universally,
right,
in 75 years or longer, depending on when you want to go back to begin the beginning of modern era.
Right.
But they haven't attempted any kind of communication with us at this point. And I know from my intelligence work that even though you know the answers, if the person isn't cleared to know the answers, you lie to them.
Mm-hmm.
And I had that. I was an intelligence officer at Richards Gebaur Air Force Base, which was outside Kansas City. Mm-hmm. And got a call. They wanted to talk to a reporter wanted to talk to intelligence officer. And I think I was the senior intelligence officer present at the time, which is not that big a deal. but
Right.
so the call was transferred to me, and the guy's telling me about this event that had happened, and I forget what it was. And I said to him, I have no knowledge of that. And he was calling me all kinds of names. I knew perfectly well he was talking to. I had the classified document sitting in front of me. I knew exactly what he was talking about, but because it was classified and the information came from a classified source, I had to deny everything because it was classified.
Right.
And he wanted somebody to go on the record and say, yes, this is what's going on. I talked to an intelligence officer out at the air base, and he said blah 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 blah. Well, I wasn't going to give him that kind of a quote, so I just denied knowing everything, even though I knew it. And I think that's where we are. They just deny this stuff until they can no longer deny it. The events overwhelmed them, and it now is clear as what's going on.
But there have been so many whistleblowers. I mean, you look at, Paul Hellyer, Canadian Minister of Defense, rest in peace, because I know he just passed recently in the last few months. He just came right out and said it. It's like, nope, they're there. How many retired military, personnel, astronauts, so many people coming forward and saying, no, it's all there. We've seen it. They're finally just doing it. It's like, wow.
But the problem is we have 75 years of denial.
Yeah.
75 years of the curtain of ridicule coming down.
Right.
So you look at Paul Hellyer, and what did the Canadian government and other officials say about him?
Right.
Which undermined his credibility. And we have a lot of that going, especially.
Which is expected.
It's hard to argue with Edgar Mitchell.
For sure.
but almost any other military officer that you would talk to when he came out, you would find him belittled by his colleagues. We talked to retired Brigadier General Arthur Exon, who gave us an awful lot of information about Roswell. And then suddenly he began to backpedal on it. And I think the problem was somebody talked to him. Once the information got out that we had talked to Exxon and he was telling us this stuff, somebody talked to him, and he began to change his story a little bit. But in the end, and I say in the end because he passed away, he was verifying that what he told us was accurate.
Right.
But he was saying, well, but you put too much of a firsthand account on it. I don't have that much firsthand information. Well, he had some, and he was talking to the people who did have it. But you've got that to deal with. And I think the reason the Air Force never talked to him during their investigation in 1995 is they didn't want to have to attack the credibility of an Air Force Brigadier General, a retired Brigadier General, nonetheless. Right. But they didn't want to attack his credibility. So they ignored him. I talked to McAndrew, who was working with Colonel Weaver. I've since talked to Colonel Weaver a number of times. Right. Who was running the Air Force investigation. But McAndrew used to call me periodically, says, you can tell me that you're just in it for the money and I won't think any less of you. And I said, that's not the case. I would have written the book if there was.
You can make money at this? That's what I would have said. It's like, what?
Well, and that's the other thing. Yeah, we're making a lot of money here doing UFO.
Yeah.
Would you like to see the bills?
Right.
But the point is, they, at the time I was a captain, they in the reserve, they were wouldn't mind making fun of me because I have no political power. But Exxon could be somewhat problematic. But that was the attitude of them. There's nothing to this. There can't be anything to this. Ergo, people who are telling you this must be lying. And yet we've got. I mentioned Major Easley, Colonel Easley. He retired as a full colonel, talking to us about it. Patrick Saunders, same thing. He was the base adjutant in 1947, and on the flyleafs of both the UFO crash at Roswell and the truth about the UFO crash at Roswell, he wrote on the flyleaf of these books, and he bought copies of these books. And they sent them to his relatives and his friends, explaining what's going on. And one of them, this is the truth, and I never told anybody anything, and signed his name to it. Well, there's a document. Granted, it was created in the 1990s, but here's a guy who was there in 1947 saying, here's the truth. He has no motivation to do that unless it's the truth, and he wanted to tell his family and his close friends what the truth was.
Right.
The only exception we ran into was Colonel Barrowclaw, who was, I forget whether he was the executive officer or the deputy base commander. He was the number 2 or number 3 guy at the base at the time. He wrote to Ken Jeffrey and said, "This is, there's nothing to this, and I wish you people would leave me alone," type of thing. But everyone that we were able to talk to says, "Yeah, this happened, and here's what happened." And we talked to a number of very credible people about this whole thing. We also, unfortunately, had to discredit some of the witnesses, as I mentioned earlier, simply because we discovered they weren't telling the truth. And I think if you're going to do an investigation about this, you have to say, here's where we made a mistake, but we're correcting it now.
Right.
This guy's information cannot be trusted, so we're not going to be using it anymore.
So, in your opinion, with finding extraterrestrials in Roswell, because there's a lot of naysayers and no, it's a hoax. In your opinion, with your own investigation, were there real extraterrestrials there?
I believe so. I'm not as positive as I used to be because some of the witnesses have folded, but I cannot see anything else. There's just no other terrestrial explanation for it at the time.
Right.
That may not be a high enough bar to leap. I mean, we cannot say here's pictures of them or here's parts of the debris, which clearly is not manufactured on Earth.
Long
we cannot
gone,
do
right?
that.
Yeah.
But we can. I've sat in the rooms with these people and talked to them and got a feeling for their stories. I mean, I was the first person to talk to Gerald Anderson, for example. And in discussing his testimony with Don Schmidt, I said, we just, this just doesn't feel right. Just not right. And then we found him altering his testimony as new information came out. He told me in the first interview, and I'm the first one that ever talked to him about this. Stan Friedman talked to him later. And he told me that the aliens that he saw, and he saw them over on the plains of San Augustine, he had milky blue eyes. He used the term milky blue eyes. I finally discovered where he got that description. If you go to the hardback copy of Whitley Strieber's Transformation, there's an alien on the front cover, and he has milky blue eyes. And so that's where he picked that up. Once he learned that everybody else is describing the eyes as very dark, he changed it to dark eyes. And they said, well, he said murky blue, and you misunderstood him. I said, would you like to hear the tape? That kind of thing. So, we ran in that kind of thing, but there were people that we talked to in the beginning, such as Anderson, that we just didn't get a good vibe from. There were people we talked to that we got a good vibe from who weren't telling us the truth. But right. some of them, this just doesn't feel right. And so we looked for all the information we could, but we did that with everybody, whether we thought we were getting a good vibe from the person or not. We tried to verify the accounts as best we can. Anderson, for example, said, well, the reason they were out on the plains of San Augustine, we're looking for moss agate. And so Don and I visited a gemologist in Albuquerque, I think it was, and said, if I was going to go to look for moss agate here in New Mexico, where would I go to look? And he told me a couple of places where you could go find moss agate. I said, what about the plains of San Augustine? He says, nah, you can find some banded agate there, but no moss agate. Right. And after we published that information, pretty soon Anderson's saying, well, we're looking for moss agate and banded agate. Well, that's clearly an indication he's making the story up because he's got new information and he's feeding it back to us.
Right. I have a comment and a question for you. Dolly says, I'm unaware of your research and I do apologize. I'm curious as to your specific evidence, personal evidence, I guess, and your opinion of the intentions of ET, which based, I guess, on your research, have you formed an opinion?
The only thing I can think of, and the problem is we're dealing with an alien intelligence, and we really have no way of gauging how accurate it is. If we were talking about dealing with other members of the human race widely separated from us, we can make a guess about how they would react based on our common ancestry and our common humanity. But with the aliens, we can't do that.
Right.
Other than we can say, well, we're all sentient beings. for whatever that means.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things is, what is their lifespan? Now, if they're a very long-lived species, let's say their lifespan is 2,000 years,
Mm-hmm.
they're probably going to move at a much slower pace than we do.
Right.
Because we have to get things done. They can stress things out. So taking 70 years, 75 years of our time to study us before they make contact probably doesn't seem like that long. It'd be like, I was taking 2 or 3 years before we contact a human entity.
Right.
We just don't know. I stray away from the abduction phenomenon because there are so many different avenues. I think it was John Mack who said there was a curious matching between the abductees and the researchers, meaning that John Mack got aliens with sort of an Eastern philosophy, and Bud Hopkins got the cold, calculating scientific aliens, and David Jacobs got the aliens who are creating hybrids to take over the earth or whatever they're going to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do you put that together? And
it's pretty wide field.
But the other thing, isn't that an influence of the investigator? It seems odd that Jacobs didn't get any of the cold scientists or the Eastern philosophers, and Mack didn't get any of the hybrid people.
Mm-hmm.
And so it seemed to me that, and Mack had said this a couple of times. He said it in Bryant's book on the Close Encounters of the Fourth Kind, the MIT conference, that there was this curious matching. So we can't really draw any conclusions from that because we're not getting uncontaminated information. Bud Hopkins had issued a challenge once and said, "Show where I'm leading the witness." And I thought, challenge accepted. And used a number of his transcripts and showed, here are the leading questions you are asking. And I'm sure Bud didn't realize the problem with that. When you're dealing with hypnosis, you have to be very careful on how you respond and how you ask your questions, because it's very simple to lead someone under the influence of hypnosis in the direction you want them to go. You have to be very careful. And even if they're not hypnotized, again, the way you ask the questions can introduce your opinions into the conversation inadvertently.
Right.
So I don't really have a good clue. All we can say for certain is they apparently attempt to avoid damage. People have been injured by close approaches of UFOs. We know that there's a series of sightings. Levelland, of course, springs to mind, where the UFO interacted in the environment. We had in a period of 2.5, 3 hours near Levelland, Texas, witnesses all over independently reporting their cars being stalled, the lights being dimmed, the radios filled with static. And when the UFO left the immediate vicinity, then the car could be started again and everything began to work properly. But that was an unintentional consequence of a close approach of the UFO, and it's not universal with all UFO sightings. So, was it one specific group, or was it one specific type of craft they were flying that caused these electromagnetic effects? So, but they seem to be avoiding conflict, but we don't know that for sure. People talk about the prime directive, which of course is Star Trek,
right.
Observe but don't communicate, don't influence, don't affect. But we don't know if they operate that way. We don't know if they're observing us and they're frightened of us because of our warlike capabilities. I mean,
maybe we're just unstable.
Is there a time in human history where we haven't had a war going on somewhere?
True. It's 100%. 100%. I think we're barbaric in a lot of ways. We're primitive in a lot of ways. And I think they would love to see or deal with a more advanced civilization and such. And I mean, I don't think we're ever going to get there. It's like are we being suppressed, by our own ruling leaders, or is there just a reason that they're just not coming forward?
Well, and that's a good question. We've got monsters running around on our planet. I hesitate to any names, Putin. But I mean, what we're hearing about Ukraine is strictly barbaric.
It is.
Unbelievably barbaric in this day and age. I would think that the one thing you would have learned from World War II is a way of engaging the population. And I guess that's kind of a historical point. Had Hitler gone into Russia the way he did, but had his soldiers treated the Russian people not as enemy or less than human, they would have sided with Hitler being freed from the Soviet yoke.
Yeah.
And you read the historical accounts, you can see that. So we couldn't believe it. And suddenly now you've got all the Russian people now mad at the Germans as well. And we're seeing that in the Ukraine. They didn't learn that, and they're committing the Russian soldiers are committing the atrocities that are just horrendous. But if I'm an alien civilization watching that, I can download it on my iPad, watch it on my phone.
Yeah. No, it's true. Why would they want to communicate with somebody? We just can't get ourselves together.
Yeah, and they know that at the moment we pose no threat to them. Yes, we have atomic weapons, and they've seen us detonate them all over the planet. We have a capability of rockets throughout our solar system. And in fact, we actually launched one, I think has finally left the solar system. One of the Viking probes, I think it was, finally left the confines of the solar system after traveling for 75 years because the solar system is so large.
Right.
And they expect it to make contact with another civilization in 80,000 years. So we pose no threat to them because we can't get out of the solar system. We can get to Mars. We can get to the outer planets. We can do all of that, but we really have no capability of going interstellar distances at this point.
Right.
So we pose no threat to them.
Right.
At this point, the movie "The Day the Earth Stood Still," the good one from 1951, not the
I remember it.
Reeves was in.
Not like I'm that old, people, but I do love classics.
Well, that movie was just on Classic Movies, but 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I watched it again.
Right.
But it's clear that they're talking interplanetary distances.
Yes.
Did he come from Mars or Venus? And in 1951, we didn't know Venus was 850 degrees Fahrenheit on the surface.
Right.
Which would melt your spacecraft when it landed.
Right.
And of course, we're still talking about are there canals on Mars, which would be proof of civilization and that sort of thing. So but the point is they were talking about interplanetary distances, and that posed a threat to these other civilizations in our solar system. We pose no threat to a civilization that is on a planet in another star system. And what star system would that be? Proxima Centauri is the closest star at 4.1 light years. It's part of a triple star system: Alpha Centauri, Beta Centauri, and Proxima Centauri. Earth-like planets or sun-like stars, I think we have to move out to 8 or 9 light years before we get to anything like that, and we just have no capability of traveling those distances.
No, I agree. I agree with you. I wouldn't want to communicate with us either. I mean, like, what the hell are you guys doing down there? You're just like a bunch of kids out at recess causing all sort of havoc, Kelly Crawford says, I guess within your research, what about all this cow stuff? Is that ETs or government? Have you come across that in your research, Kevin?
Oh, absolutely. At one point, I was a member of APRO, which is now defunct because the Lorenzens passed away. Again, Bob Cornett and I were doing UFO research, and he joined NICAP and I joined APRO. So we could share the newsletters and we wouldn't have to be members of both organizations. Saving a buck here because we were college students. But Jim Lorenzen called me one day and he said, there's these cattle mutilations going up in Minnesota. You want to go take a look at it? And so I called Bob and we talked about it. And we said, sure, we'll go take a look at it. At the time, they were talking about it being a satanic cult of some kind. So we went fairly well armed.
We're ready for you
to look at it. But we got up there and looked at the evidence. They were talking about, there's all these circles of melted in the snow that look like landing places for UFOs. And so we go out and we're talking to the farmer, and he said, oh, that's where our silos used to be. We've moved them, but there's still the silage remains there, which is decaying, creating heat, and that causes the snow to melt in the circular pattern. And he said, well, there was landing traces on this lake out here. And he said, no, I was chopping holes in the ice to get water for the cattle. And every time we talked about something like that, we found a terrestrial explanation for it.
Right.
I talked to a vet in Wisconsin, Grant County, Wisconsin, because there was a UFO investigator that showed up, and he was talking about, well, every time we get a UFO sighting, we get a cattle mutilation and that sort of thing. So I was up there talking to the vet about that, and he said, yeah, I think the farmer did it for the insurance money. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, the cow had been sickly from its birth. And if the cow died of natural causes or disease, then the farmer didn't get any insurance money for it. But if it was killed and mutilated by the Satanists, well, then he got his insurance money. And he said, then the mutilations really weren't consistent with those you'd seen in other animals. The state of New Mexico commissioned a former FBI agent. And I know by saying, well, he was an FBI agent, but this was back when they were actually good. And he had the FBI agent had no dog in the fight. I mean, he didn't care what the explanation was. He was looking for the explanation, following the evidence. The name was Ken Randle, did a report for the state of New Mexico and found that in the instances that he investigated, the mutilations were the kind you'd expect from predators and scavengers. It was the soft tissues. And you look at some of the cattle mutilation discussion, I said, well, we're talking about upside mutilations, meaning the cow's laying on its side and the upside is mutilated, but the bottom side is not. And one of them said, well, there's no evidence of predators or scavengers here around this cow.
Some of them are pretty crazy. Like,
well, but they said, well, here's a picture of a cow and there's no predator footprints around it. Right. And I'm thinking, look at the bird droppings all over the carcass, for crying out loud. The scavengers flew in.
Right. Right.
I never came across a case that suggested any kind of alien presence. And then the next question you have to ask is why? What could they possibly gain by that? Mm-hmm. What are they looking for? Is cow udders a delicacy on Alpha Centauri? And if so
could it be military? Some equipment better on the. I mean, I won't say better on the cows. I don't think it's better to do it to anybody.
There was a incident at Dugway in the 60s, I think it was, where some compound, some gas that they were testing escaped and killed a whole bunch of farm animals, I think sheep, and may have killed a couple of people. This is from memory, and I
right, no problem. We won't hold you to it. Internet. Come back to
have a look at the experiment going bad.
Right.
So we had to take a look at all that, but I don't think the military, I don't think it's government. I think it's mostly natural predation and scavenging that causes those sorts of things. There was a thing in Washington State, I think around the Seattle area, where somebody did a newspaper article and said that fallout from the atomic detonations in the Pacific, the testing, was causing windshields to be pitted in the Seattle area. And suddenly everybody was seeing this pitting to their windshield, something they'd never seen before. Mm-hmm. And the explanation was, yeah, that's because you look through the windshield, you don't look at it. And so if you went out and examined your windshield, you saw the pitting, the minor pitting here and there on the windshield, and you thought it was due to the fallout. And it was just because you weren't looking through you weren't looking at the windshield, you were looking through it.
Right.
So fallout wasn't pitting windshields is the point. And I think that's where we are on the cattle mutilations. We don't hear that much about them.
But what about other animals? You're not seeing other animals like in
the
same.
There have been some other animals. Oh yeah, absolutely. Okay. There have been sheep mutilations. There have been other animal mutilations, horse mutilations. Not the way you do with cattle mutilations, though. But right. Another guy, Ian Summers, and I can't remember Kagan's first name. Why am I always fall apart on one first name? But Kagan and Summers did a book called Mute Evidence, and they were commissioned by Doubleday. to go out and study the cattle mutilation situation. Anybody who wants to learn about cattle mutilations need to read that book, because again, they had no dog in the fight. They didn't care what the explanation was. They were out there researching it. These are the conclusions they came to, which was in direct conflict with what a number of UFO investigators were saying.
Right.
They said, yeah, what the vets tell them, what some of the police agencies tell them, what some of the ranchers tell them, this is not anything unusual. So you take a look at all that documentation, and I've looked at all that documentation. I've got a copy of the Randle report, which he actually sent to me, which I thought was kind of funny. I got a copy of Mute Evidence, and then I got a call from a publisher one day wanting to know if they should republish Mute Evidence. And I said, absolutely. This is a wonderful book. You need to get that book out there again. I got a nice note from either Kagan or Summers thanking me for my recommendation. But I thought it was a book that if you're going to study cattle mutilations, you have to read this book.
Right.
And you have to read it with an open mind. You can't say, well, these guys were government agents or whatever. They were paid by a publisher to investigate cattle mutilations. And clearly the publisher didn't care which way it went. They just wanted the explanation for what was going on.
Right.
So that's kind of where we are on that.
So yeah, so it's there's no agenda. It's just black and white. This is what our findings are. We were asked to do it. Okay.
Oh, there's a nice chapter with Leo Sprinkle in there talking about his experiences, and there's Carl Flock has made an appearance in the book, and but it's an interesting read. And if you're going to study cattle mutilations, you want to know what's going on, you need to read those two documents as well as the other things suggesting that the extraterrestrials are involved in cattle mutilations.
There we go. There's a very detailed answer for you, Kelly. I'm going to take one little moment because I have to do a station ID. So you are listening to The Outer Realm with myself and Amelia Pisano, minus Amelia Pisano tonight, who's under the weather. Tonight we are joined by Kevin Randle. We're discussing all kinds of fun stuff like Roswell, cattle mutilations. Levelland is going to be coming up very shortly, his new book. So for those tuning in, we hope you're having a good time. The chat room is lighting up. A lot of fantastic people. Kathleen Ann Ball, Kelly, Dolly, Lisa, Marisol, Michelle Millens. We've got Joseph. We've got, oh my God, we're really going up there. Doreen, Zachman, hello, Tyler, all kinds of people. This is fantastic. So also Wayne Murphy, Team Templar, North America. Hello, hello. Mike Walker. Fantastic. So tonight we are fully sponsored by Folgers Coffee, who have been with us since day one. Thank you, Folgers. We love you and we so appreciate you taking care of us forever and ever. So just little, keep going. We love you. Big thank you, Dr. Snick, the sonic surgeon, for the intro and outro. Justin is an award-winning composer of Halloween horror sci-fi and dark wave electronic music. Seek him out anywhere where you can find some fantastic music. And thank you for doing so. So we're back to you.
Well, the one thing I have to point out is Levelland is out.
Yes. So we're tonight. That's what's next to talk about.
Here's the book.
Yes. Promote. That's what this is all about. So tell us about Levelland. What prompted you to write about this area?
I think it's one of the most important UFO sightings. And the reason I say that is, and I mentioned earlier, that it involves an interaction with the environment. It is about witnesses at separate locations, independently reporting what they had seen, that their car engines were stalled, the headlights dimmed, the radios filled with static. And once the UFO left, then they could start the cars again. The sheriff was involved. And after receiving multiple calls, he in one newspaper account said that he had received hundreds of calls about this UFO. I think it was closer to dozens, but there were a lot of calls. He decided he needed to go out and search the area. I don't want to say look for himself, because it sounds like he got lost and he went out looking for himself. But he was in what I call a mini convoy. He had one of the sheriff's cars with a deputy in the car with him. Behind him was the Texas Department of Public Safety. I think that's what they called it in 1957. I think that's right. which is basically the Texas State Police. And behind that car was a car with Air Force officers in it, which hasn't come out until just now. And the sheriff is quoted in the Air Force report on it as seeing an object in the distance, not an object, but a streak of light in the distance for a couple of seconds. In newspaper accounts before the Air Force investigation and afterwards, the sheriff, whose name was Weir Clem, and I hate that name. I wanted something like Jack Armstrong, some good, solid name, as opposed to something sort of regional. But he told reporters that he'd seen an object, a football-shaped or oval-shaped object. When he talked to the Air Force investigator, he talked about a streak of light in the distance, and I think that was kind of coach testimony, probably done by the FBI. And then later on, he was interviewed by a fellow named Don Berliner. And again, in the 1970s, after he'd retired from the sheriff's office, talked about the shape of the object and being much closer to it than the Air Force report suggests. Now, what's interesting about this is another fellow, Don Burlinson, and there's a lot of Dons in this story. And if I really worked at it, I could bring in Don Schmidt and Don Kehoe and have.
Yeah, you have to help us keep up.
But Don Burlinson talked to the widow of the sheriff around the turn of the century, I think in 2000. And between what she said and what the sheriff's daughter said, he did get much closer. And there may have been landing traces that were not researched properly. The sheriff went out to I think it was a ranch north of town, north of Levelland, where the rancher had found a circular burned area. And of course, the rancher had since passed away, and Burlinson couldn't talk to them, but he talked to the daughter who went with her father out to see the burned area. So we have a firsthand witness about that. So it brings another dimension to the case. But the real point is that Burlinson talked to the guy who'd been the mechanic in the sheriff's office in 1957 and told Burlinson that the day after these events in Levelland, the sheriff came in and wanted his car checked out. The only reason I can think of is the sheriff wanting his car checked out the day after this event was because his car was stalled, and they're looking for an explanation. None of that had come out. It always, when we reported on Levelland, and I'm as guilty as everybody else on that point, we looked at the Air Force account. We looked at some of the newspaper accounts. We didn't go into depth in the investigation. And it's only all these years later that we began to look at it. But we have all these witnesses. Now, the Air Force in the documentation says they don't want to respond to Don Kehoe, who was the NICAP director at the time, wanted to see what NICAP had to say about the sighting because it's easier to respond to it than put out their press release prior to that. And if Kehoe was talking about 9 witnesses to the craft, and the Air Force came out and said, no, there were only 3 witnesses. And what the Air Force managed to do was divert the conversation from what happened to the number of witnesses. And looking at the Air Force file, I think I picked out witnesses at 13 separate locations that the Air Force was aware of. But if the Air Force didn't interview the witness, then it didn't count. So they just ignored that. But there's information in the Project Blue Book files of at least 5 witnesses to the craft and that sort of thing. We also know the Air Force said, well, the sightings were very short-lived, just seconds and some red thing in the distance. I think one of the witnesses talked about having his car stalled, and he got out to walk toward the craft. Well, he sat in the car for a while. He got outside and looked at his car. He was there for 15 minutes before the craft left. So he got a good look at it. Others talked about minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes being around there. And as I said, the sheriff talked about literally dozens of people calling about this thing that had been transpiring in the Levelland area, this glowing red object, which is, I have on the book this bright, it's really kind of a bright orange object, which is a good representation of what most people saw. Talking about that object being close at hand, getting close to them and installing their cars, or at least seeing it in the distance. But the important point really is we've got multiple witnesses, multiple chains of evidence, which is something that we always should look at. We have the eyewitness testimony. Well, that's one chain of evidence. It may not be the best chain of evidence, and we know that eyewitness testimony is often flawed and can be problematic, but it also can be very good. and very
Mhm.
important. You can't just reject it because, well, we don't want to believe the eyewitnesses. We
Right.
have the interaction with the environment, installing the car engines. We have the burn area, which if anybody had bothered to go out there and research that properly and gathered samples, we might have a whole different conversation right now.
Right.
So we have all of that going on in Levelland, plus the witnesses calling the sheriff to talk about it. The Air Force eventually decided that what they saw was ball lightning. In 1957,
Ball lightning.
in
All right.
1957, scientists were arguing about the reality of ball lightning. We're
Oh,
using a
wow.
phenomenon to discuss the solution to another phenomenon.
Right.
But the thing is, if you accept ball lightning as being a real phenomenon, and many scientists now do, but some still don't,
Right.
you're talking about something that is very small, 18
Mhm.
inches to 24 inches in diameter, a foot and a half to 2 feet, and very short-lived, a matter of seconds. And it doesn't manifest itself all over an area for 2.5 to 3 hours.
No.
But the Air Force explanation is still ball lightning. And I would be embarrassed if I was an Air Force officer.
I was gonna say, like, don't they hold any regard for credibility? Like,
In 1957, the whole point was to explain the flying saucers. They
right.
didn't care if the explanation made sense, just
Right.
so long as they had one.
Come up with
And,
something, anything. Right.
let's throw a bunch of explanations at the wall and see which one sticks. So
Right.
what I find incredible is, okay, in 1957, I can sort of see them accepting that as the explanation. But when we get to the closing of Blue Book in 1969, that explanation should have been eliminated. If they could come up with something else. The guy that investigated, he was a mid-ranking NCO named Norman Barth. Came down from Colorado Springs. I'm thinking he got an Air Force base 15 minutes away from Levelland. They bring a
Right.
guy from Colorado Springs down to investigate it. He spends 7 hours in Levelland talking to people. And we don't know what he did for the whole 7 hours because there's a period of time where he just disappeared.
No.
Probably lunch or something.
No.
We know that Air Force officers were involved in the sightings because they were with the sheriff. We have no information about what they said or what they did or what they felt, which would be critical to understanding the case. And
Mhm.
as I say, in the book, this is the first time anybody's talked about Air Force officers, and I've got documentation to back up the Air Force officers were there. It was reported in a number of newspapers that nobody seemed to have caught on until I was reading
Right.
all those newspapers carefully.
My gosh.
The
Wow.
explanation doesn't work. They talked about it being misty, drizzly in Levelland at the time this took place. We have a weather report, coincidentally from Roswell, that gave the weather in that whole area that it was, I think, 4/10 overcast, which means 4/10 of the sky was obscured by clouds, not necessarily at all the same
Mhm.
level. So it was basically a clear sky. There was no rain. Dr. James McDonald had gone through the weather records from that time frame and said, yeah, there had been rain in the area in the morning, but that front had passed by and it had all cleared out by the time you get to the Levelland sightings. So their explanation of the mist causing the engines to fail and all of that stuff, it failed itself. But then you have to ask yourself, well, gee whiz, why wasn't there always this epidemic of car engine failures when it was raining in the area
Exactly.
one night? Hynek actually
Exactly.
said, I think it's one of the documents in the Blue Book files, actually said, well, the first witness to report this to the sheriff, Pedro Sacito, his car had been repaired the day before, and there was a piece of metal in the distributor, which may have caused the engine to short out. And you have to ask yourself, well, how come it shorted out when this object was in view in front of them? And once it left, he could start his car again.
That's right.
And
Well,
then
all
you've
those
got,
little obvious points that
you've
we
got
failed to
and
mention.
then you've got other people talking about this. And Hynek says, well, a second car would be coincidence, but by the time you get to the third car, you've pretty well moved beyond the realm of coincidence. You've got
You
some
would
kind
think. Yeah.
as they said in Goldfinger, once is happenstance, twice is coincidence, third time is enemy action. So by the time you get to the third point, you're saying, well, maybe this is enemy action now.
Exactly. Right. So do you think that they really did go and examine the burn marks? They just didn't make that public or didn't talk about it? I mean, how do you not with something like that? How do you just let that go?
Well, my question is, why wouldn't Barth have interviewed the Air Force personnel who were with the sheriff
Yeah,
and had their car stalled? Because if the sheriff's car stalled, then their car stalled because they all
that's
got
right.
close enough. And even if their car didn't stall because they didn't get quite close enough, they were with the sheriff and they knew his car had stalled.
That's
So the question becomes, where are their reports?
Mhm.
There is newspaper articles the next day that the provost marshal at Reese Air Force Base was with the sheriff, and they went out and looked at some of the landing areas for burn marks and allegedly didn't find anything. But
Mm.
there were civilian investigators in the area. NICAP had an investigator, and his name escapes me, in the area, and he may well have gone out there, but there's nothing in the NICAP files to talk about that either. So I don't know why we didn't get that information. But we have the same problem with Socorro, where we've got the landing cases with Lonnie Zamora, and there are things that could have been done that weren't. You have to say, well, why weren't they? This would make perfect investigative sense to do this.
Mhm.
But an EMP doesn't really explain it because these cars weren't electronic in the sense of the cars today. If there was an EMP, it would knock out your car and you wouldn't be restarting it. But the other thing is, once the field was removed, you were able to start the car.
Mhm.
And so that suggests that it was suppressing it in some fashion. Now we know, based on, and in the book I go into the electromagnetic effects and how we know it's electromagnetic and that sort of thing.
Mhm.
So we know that a strong enough magnetic field could suppress the car engines. And the Condon Committee said, well, we're not going to look at this because we can think of no mechanism. Once you remove that field, the car would spontaneously start. Mark Rodiker at the Center for UFO Studies had done a survey of 485, I think, instances of vehicle interference. And if you go through that carefully, because I did, you realize that very few cases does the witness say the car restarted spontaneously. They say, well, the car operated properly, or the driver took some action and he could start the car again. So it's not a spontaneous thing. The car had to restart. The lights would come back on.
Right.
Although there was one case in near Amarillo that took place a couple of hours before the events in Levelland, and Amarillo is not that far from Levelland, all both in the Texas Panhandle area, where a couple's car was stalled by a UFO and they couldn't get it started, and the battery had been destroyed in some fashion. They had to have the car towed into Amarillo. Now, what annoys me about this, and this kind of gets to your question as well, they reported it to the police. They went to the Amarillo police and said, where do you report a UFO sighting? And the police didn't bother writing down the names. I can give you a description of what the couple looked like. They were young. They were in their 20s. He was about 6 feet tall. She was a little shorter. They were wearing red coats. There's a lot of information, but nobody bothered to write down the names. That there's dynamite police work for you. But it did destroy the battery. So we've got that information, but we do have a great deal of information about the car engines being stalled. And it's not just Levelland and this one area. 2 days later, I think on November 4th, a group of cars near El Grande, New Mexico were stalled. The close approach of an egg-shaped object. A fellow named James Stokes talked about it. He also had a light sunburn-like effect. You remember Close Encounters of the Third Kind with Richard Dreyfuss and half his face?
Yes.
Richard Stokes had the same thing, not to the extent that Dreyfuss did. And the sunburn faded away in a matter of hours, but Cor Lorenzen, Jim Lorenzen, and Terry Clark, who was a radio news director in Alamogordo, saw all of this, but those cars were stalled. So we had a rash of car stallings around the desert Southwest at that time, and in other areas of the United States. And as I said, Rodiker looked for specifically vehicle interference. When I did the Levelland book, I brought in other aspects of it, like radio stations being knocked off the air, blackouts in cities, animal reaction to close approach of UFOs. And I think that's well documented in the UFO literature, that sometimes the animals react to it. In France in 1954, there were any number of cases of cars being stalled and that sort of thing. And in 1954, there were also a lot of reports of the witnesses being paralyzed by whatever's going on. They were unable to move and that sort of thing. We had a couple of those cases as well in the United States, but that was the big wave in France in 1954. And I detail some of that in the book as well. So it's not just Levelland we're looking at. That kind of is the main focus of the book, but these other things are important to understand, that Levelland is not a standalone event, that there's a lot of this going on.
Right.
And the Condon Committee didn't want to investigate it. They said, well, yeah, it just doesn't make sense to us, so we're not going to do that. And we can't find the cars anyway, so it doesn't make any difference. So it's something that's inexplicable today. What phenomena would have caused that? The cars to stall in that fashion. And
it says plasma can burn like the sun. Imagine so.
But we've got, I don't know if the other witnesses with Stokes exhibited the sunburn, because none of them ever came forward.
Right.
And I think the reason is because they saw how Stokes was treated. Stokes was an engineer at Hulleman Air Force Base in Alamogordo.
So he would have been fairly respected.
Well, and he was on his way to El Paso. And to get to El Paso from Alamogordo, you drive through Oro Grande, New Mexico. And there were other cars on the road that had been stalled before he got there. So when he returned to Alamogordo, he called his boss at the Air Force Base and said, "Do you mind if I talk about this? Can I tell people about this?" And the major said, "Did it happen while you were at work? Did it happen on the base?" And Stokes said, "No." I said, "Well, go ahead and tell everybody." And so it's released that he's an engineer on the base. The Air Force attacked his reputation. Said, "Well, our investigator didn't see any signs of the sunburn." Yeah, it faded before you got there, guy. And he's really not an engineer, because we can't find any schooling that he was an engineer.
Wow.
Then you have the Air Force at his people at the Hulleman Air Force Base. Well, yes, he's an engineer. He's been working as an engineer here. He's not a technician. He's an engineer. And he got promoted to a higher grade not long after this event took place. So you had the Air Force arguing with itself about the qualifications of this guy. But what the people saw was, the guy's being smeared by the government. Well, he's just embellishing his account. We're not sure it's even true, and we didn't see any evidence of this, that, and the other thing. And he changed the number of cars stalled on the road. He said 6, and now it's 7. Well, how many cars was it? Picking this little thing about. And I can understand him. I think in the illustration he drew, which is in the Project Blue Book files, and a copy of it's in the book, I think he drew 6 cars or 7 cars. I don't remember the number of cars he drew on it. But there was one guy who took pictures, and he was going to go to El Paso and sell them to a newspaper, but he never did. The pictures never showed up. Stokes got the last name of one of the guys and the first name of another guy, and they never came forward. And the Air Force made no effort to find them. Because if there was another witness, well, that just made it even worse for them. So they could smear Stokes and get away with it, but then they would have to begin smearing other people. And we've seen them do that repeatedly. A guy named William Rhodes took a picture in July of 1947 of a craft over Phoenix, Arizona, which looked remarkably like the early illustration that Kenneth Arnold made of the objects that he had seen a couple of weeks earlier. And you look at the Air Force file, and they say, well, this guy claims that he's the director of Panasonic Research Laboratories, but that's just a lab in his backyard. He's got these delusions of grandeur, and he claims to have a PhD, and the only thing he had was a little miniature card saying he had a PhD from Columbia, and they don't know a thing about him, and he's living off the money his wife makes. Well, if you look into the guy's background, you find out that during World War II, he worked for the Navy, and the Navy had given a number of tests. They didn't have enough scientists working, and they designed a number of tests. And if you passed it at one level, you got the equivalency of a bachelor's degree. And if you passed it at a higher level, you got the equivalency of a master's degree. And if you passed it at the highest level, you got equivalency of a PhD. And so Rhodes managed to pass the test at the highest level. So the Navy qualified him as a PhD. I talked to a friend of Rhodes who worked with him, and he said, well, Rhodes had a pretty abrasive personality. He liked to solve problems, but he didn't like to take orders. Wanted to get him work at, I think it was Arizona State. but the guy brought him in, and this is all on my blog. If you just type in Rhodes, you can read the whole story there.
Mm-hmm.
But Rhodes was brought in to solve the problem, which he did. And then they offered him a job, but he just didn't want to do that sort of thing. He also held a number of patents, and he was being paid royalties on the patents. So the guy was a scientist. He held patents. He wasn't living off his wife's money. He liked to play piano, so he played at a local nightclub a couple of nights a week. So the Air Force used that against him.
Mm-hmm.
It's just trying to smear his reputation. Well, you can't believe this guy. He probably faked the photographs.
Yeah.
And you can see that through it. So by the time we get to 1957, and certainly by 1964, when Lonnie Zamora had his sighting, you can see people reluctant to talk about the UFO sightings, so they want to be subjected to that kind of ridicule.
Mm-hmm. I can see that. I mean, you know, his own people were doing this to him. I have a comment for you. Wow. Oh my goodness.
Good
Christian,
one.
thank you. The orange orb is a reality, but what it is or was when I encountered it is a mystery to me. But if they tried to hit it with anything, even a pulse beam, they would not hit it, as I feel it had some type of force field around it. And its speed, I'd say, after seeing it leave, was about 10 times the speed of a high-grade bunker buster, if not faster. Perhaps even a living sentient being. I'm not sure.
Well,
I'll leave it up for you.
I talking to Cliff Stone one day. Cliff Stone says, you know, the Chilean Air Force intercepted a UFO and they shot at it and hit it without results. And he showed me the State Department message, and I read it, and it didn't say that. What it said was the Chilean Air Force attempted to intercept a UFO and fired on it without results. Didn't say a word about it being hit.
Right.
So that kind of underscores what Christian is saying there, that they wouldn't be able to hit it. There have been some cases where people have fired, I want to say slug throwers, regular pistols or rifles.
Right.
Slug thrower is the term we use in science fiction for old-fashioned weapons, where they have said they fired at these things and they've heard the rounds ricochet off the metal surface, but that would be something sitting on the ground, and I don't know exactly that. One of the guys was real drunk when he did it, so he may not have been able to hit the ground with a shot at the time. But the point is, what we see about the attempted intercepts, there's an awful lot of evidence that they can avoid our weaponry. The SR-71, which always cracks me up, is a spy plane built in the 1950s. 1950s technology. And the gag was that if a Soviet intercepted the SR-71 in a tail pursuit and fired a missile at it, the SR-71 was fast enough to outrun the missile. And that's 1950s technology. Man. And we still don't know what the top end of the SR-71 is. And I understand they're developing an SR-72, which would be just like something out of science fiction, I'm sure. I think in 1950s, the SR-71 was something out of science fiction.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So basically then, you know, as Dolly said with this whole situation, disinformation campaign by the government, which seems to be full circle, which seems to keep happening. Military, government, you know, discrediting, scare tactics.
Absolutely.
You never saw it.
Absolutely.
All lightning.
You look at their explanations, you look at the research they're done, you look at what they say.
Right.
With the Roswell case, they come out with, well, the bodies are explained by these anthropomorphic dummies. Well, the Air Force is now admitting there were bodies.
Right.
But these anthropomorphic dummies that weren't being dropped
right.
in the Roswell area until 10 years later. I think they were doing some of the high altitude parachute testing in other parts of New Mexico, but not in the Roswell area. And so, well, this is, you know, the time compression, the people just kind of thought it was 1947 and it was really 1957. They just didn't realize how much time had passed.
Right.
But the problem with that is, at the time, if you go back and you look at the press conference, you can see the media didn't buy the answer.
No.
And now they do. He said, "Oh, yeah, Roswell. See, that was a mogul balloon, wasn't it? With these anthropomorphic dummies." No, that's not an answer.
Right.
But we have to deal with that repeatedly now.
Well, I think we've just become conditioned. Mainstream media is pretty much paid for by, the ruling bodies. So,
Well, yeah, I mean, all you got to do is look at the spin in the stories, whether it's CNN, MSNBC, ABC, CBS, NBC, and let's not forget Fox News. You
Right.
you can figure out who their benefactors are,
Right.
and
Well, it's
the
all there
stories
in
they
public.
cover,
You can see it. Yeah.
and the stories they cover.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the one thing, going off on a tangent here, the president said one day, as he was leaving the podium, he mumbled, "A white man didn't invent the light bulb. It was a black man named Latimer." No, the first incandescent light was created by a guy named Alexander Volta
Right.
in 1806. There was no practical purpose for it.
Right.
But that was the basis of it. It wasn't until you get to around 1860 and the technology evolved to the point where we could create a fairly good vacuum that a guy named Swan and a guy named Edison created a practical electric incandescent light bulb. Swan's didn't work as well as Edison's because Swan's used platinum for the filament, so it was prohibitively expensive.
Yes.
Edison's used a carbon filament that lasted for around 1,200 hours. So it became practical and inexpensive.
Yes.
Latimer comes in later. He improves on the filament that Edison had created. So, when you say, well, a black man invented the light bulb, well, he certainly helped, and he made it much more practical because he created a light bulb that lasted longer. But let's give credit to the guys who got to the point where Latimer could do that sort of thing.
Right. Right.
And I didn't see anybody in the media question that. I mean, it took me like 4 minutes on the internet to discover all of this information.
Mm-hmm. It's just, I always, call them spin doctors. Spin, 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 spin. After a while, they've talked around so many circles, people head are spinning, going, okay, yeah, whatever. I think, that's the idea. Just so much disinformation. After a while, you're like, what did he say? Did he say this? Did he say this? And we're all just sort of left, But now I think with the internet and with so many people such as yourself writing about these things, it's a little bit difficult to discount it. It's not so easy to just sweep under a carpet, unless the whole world goes crazy and they start burning books. Just saying.
Well, no, it doesn't matter now if they burn books.
Yeah.
I have them all digitally.
Aha, there we go.
I probably got 150 books loaded on my iPad.
There you go.
And I haven't read. I can't.
There we go. Try that.
Them all.
Crash the system. I don't know, but
well, here's the funny thing. I've got a 1 terabyte external hard drive, about the size of a pack of cigarettes. Carry it in my pocket.
Yep.
I've got the entire Project Blue Book files on that.
Very nice.
on that external hard drive. The 130,000 documents on that
one,
along with a whole
devices.
bunch of UFO books and a whole bunch of other information.
Right.
And so the thing is, the information's escaping.
Right. It's
But
not so easy to sweep it under the carpet anymore.
not in today's environment, but they're still doing a good job because we get diverted with all the stuff going on. And
right.
who would have imagined that's the other thing that kind of caught me off guard. In the 90s, there were a whole bunch of books about the coming pandemic. And
Yes.
it all seemed to evolve out of Africa and Ebola, which is what they called a slate wiper, meaning that if you got Ebola, it killed like 90% of the people who got it.
Wow.
And so I'm thinking of a pandemic in that sense. And then we have what happened here, and it's just not that deadly, but it's altered society amazingly. So we've had the coming pandemic. I didn't recognize it for what it was at the time.
I think it's the media did its job.
The media trades on crises and bad news and clicks now.
Exactly. And I will add this. Dolly says we have so many witnesses now, government can't control that. I think it's with everything, not even just UFOs. I think people are out there now. People are aware. People want real answers. They're paying
Well,
attention.
and that's the thing we're learning with the internet and things like TikTok and Instagram and YouTube and all of that stuff. The news media is not focused in a very narrow location with people doing a job based on their personal opinions in the news media. We got people from all kinds of things arguing for their position there. And so you have to look at that. But we have such a history in the UFO field of the curtain of ridicule that it's hard to break through that because people still think of that. The example I always think of is Bill Buckner in the World Series game. Bill Buckner was an incredible first baseman. Everybody remembers the ball that got between his feet in the World Series game, and his team went on to lose the World Series because had he caught the ball, the game would have been over and it would have changed the dynamic of the series. But it wasn't over because he missed that ground ball. Everybody remembers that, but they don't remember all the good things he did. And we have that in the UFO field. I don't care how many good cases you have. They remember the hoaxes. They remember the alien autopsy. They remember the Roswell slides. They don't remember all the other good information that we've been able to gather because it's a little bit more difficult to comprehend all of that as a single package.
Yeah, it's very sad because there are a lot of really good researchers out there who were really, they were boots on the ground. They really went leaps and bounds, interviewed a lot of people, and so much information was just suppressed. And it gets, that sort of information I find gets overshadowed by projects like Blue Book.
Well, the other thing is
the buzzwords, right? Remember the buzzwords.
Some of the information gets overshadowed by the charlatans too.
Of course.
Are telling great stories. Well, I was abducted from my bed when I was 17 years old. I went and fought on Mars with our alien compadres for 20 years, and then I was returned to my bed 15 minutes after I'd been abducted. Yeah, I believe that story. But there are people who believe that, and then you have the news media looking at all of that as well, saying, how can we believe these people? They're all a bunch of conspiracy nuts, and that's the way we now dismiss it. Oh, you're just a conspiracy nut.
Well, didn't CIA coin that to try to throw us off?
There are conspiracies.
Conspiracy theories, yeah.
I think Abraham Lincoln was killed by a conspiracy.
Right.
A bunch of people acting in concert to assassinate the president and some of the governmental officials in 1865. That's a conspiracy, a real honest to God conspiracy.
I think it comes down to this. It's hard to know what everything is. It's a big universe. It's a big world. There's a lot of information that's kept from us. There are people having their own accounts all over the world. How many don't talk about it? How many, like you say, they just see how other people get treated. They take a step back. They don't talk about their experiences. It's so hard to know really what's out there, what's not out there, because there simply are a lot of people who may see something in the sky and go, nope, not even touching it. It's like not doing it.
Well, we can point to military pilots and airline pilots who wouldn't report UFOs because it would impact their job.
There we go, right there.
The Japanese, was it 1628? The Japanese Airlines saw the object in Alaska, and the pilot on the of the aircraft lost his flying job.
See, right there, there's a prime example.
And he later got it back with the help of, I think, Richard Haynes and a number of other people supporting him. But he lost his job because he reported a UFO.
Right.
And all you got to do is have one guy like that, and the information gets out that you report a UFO and you lose your job. Well, then other airline pilots have realized that. Remember the beginning of Close Encounter where the pilot is talking to the air traffic control center, and they said, well, you want to report a UFO? And the guy says, no, I don't want to report that.
Yeah, we're not going to talk about that.
Yeah,
right.
We didn't see that.
Well, I think we come from a time as well where things like that were just not acceptable to talk about. You didn't want to look like you were a Fruit Loop in front of your neighbors like back in the 40s. And it was very reserved time. Unlike now where we're like, yeah, aliens are on the mountains, let's go. But back then it's like, no, we don't talk about that. There'll be the laughing stock of the entire neighborhood, right? Like
Well,
different
I think
times.
for the longest time, NICAP didn't mind getting UFO reports, but they didn't want to hear about the creatures from inside. They just sort of ignored the occupant reports.
Well, you can.
APRA was more willing to take those reports, but NICAP just
Yeah.
kind of ignored them for a while.
Well, sure, it's easier to try to, talk away an object in the sky like ball lightning, or it's a weather balloon, or it's this, or it's this. A little bit harder to work around what's inside. It's
Yeah.
not so easy, because people can be gullible. Some people just truly don't want to be bothered. They don't care. Others believe in their governments. They believe what they're told. They're good citizens. At the end of the day, it's easier to just accept these things than it is to think maybe, just maybe, there's something that you don't understand, so you naturally fear it. Right? People want to be comfortable in their lives. They don't want to step outside the box. What is that?
Well, yeah, there's all of that. There's a lot of things working against us getting the information out.
Right.
And our own government is one of the sources of that.
Right. Well, it's been an amazing couple of hours. Honestly, I can't believe it passed so quick. You have an open door policy on the show. If you definitely want to do it again sometime and continue on the conversation, I would be delighted to have you join us and continue on, because it's just been enlightening, to say the least. So this is the part where you get to promote yourself, your website, your books, everything. Yeah. Promote.
Well, the blog is kevinrandle.blogspot.com, and it contains an awful lot of the information I talked about tonight here. There's a search engine on there and a lot of interesting stories that you can get into. The latest book is called Understanding Roswell, that just came out a few weeks ago. The book we were originally going to talk about, Levelland, came out a couple of months ago. UFOs in the Deep State, which we talked about, is also about. So there's a lot of books. If you go to Amazon, just type in Kevin Randle, and you'll see a lot of books that I had written. Some of them science fiction, but and some of them action adventure. But the UFO books usually come up first, and you can take a look at those sorts of books and see if there's something that interests you. And if you enjoyed the book, put up a nice review, because that always helps. And if you didn't enjoy the book, well,
keep your review to yourself. That's okay. I'll say it for you. We don't want to hear it. So,
well, but if sometimes you get a negative review and somebody brings up a point that's very good.
Of course, I'm just teasing.
Annoys about the Amazon thing is people will give you like 1-star rating, and the book came from the Amazon, and the cover was ripped, or the pages were ripped, or something was wrong with it.
So they're angry.
That's not my fault. It's not fair to blame the author for that. I'm not sending the book out to you. My job was just to write the book. It's the publisher to get it to you.
So base the review on the literature, not on anything else, because you only have
the conditions. Yes,
that's right. All you can do is basically talk about and take credit or discredit, whatever it is, for the book. So, look, here's we always call my honorary co-host. Great show tonight. Thank you, Kevin, for joining us. Thank you for your service. Have a good night, everybody. Have a great weekend. See, I don't even have to sign off. I love it. So, thank you, Sandra.
It's been a real joy. I've enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you very much. Like I said, open door policy. Okay. So anytime, you're always welcome.
Well, thank you very much. And you have a good weekend.
And you as well.
Good night, all.
Hey, good night. Oh, God, he's so delightful. I love it. So thank you. Huge thank you to Kevin Randle for sharing all of his stories with us. And he is a wealth of information. Check him out. He's obviously got, quite a few books on the topic. Huge thank you to Folgers Coffee for sponsoring us tonight and every night, and for the last couple of years. Thank you. Big thank you, Dr. Snick, aka Justice Snicker, for providing us with your music and your voice. Thank you. So, guys, remember to stop by the International Public Radio on YouTube. Throw them a like. Don't forget about Little Old Us over on Facebook on the Outer Realm. Also, don't forget to check out Team Templar North America. Show us a little bit of love there too. Great things coming there. That's all I can say. If I'm excited, if I'm lending my name to it, you know it's going to be good. Otherwise, I wouldn't be there. So please check them out. If you'd like to connect with Amelia and myself, or maybe like to be a guest on the show or recommend a guest on the show, please go on over to the Outer Realm Contact at gmail.com. Email only. Social media is just a disaster. Too many places, too many groups. So the Outer Realm Contact at gmail.com. Tune in next week. Yes. We have Lisa Savoy in the chat room tonight, and she's actually going to be on next Thursday evening. And she is an abductee, and she has shared her experiences in her new book. So come check her out. It's going to be a fantastic show. Wednesday evening, we are going to be welcoming back Carol Costa. This time around, however, she's not talking about UFOs. She's going to be talking about magic and witchcraft. That's right. Magic and witchcraft. And what the hell am I looking at right now, Joe? It's not going across the screen. What? Anyway, so all of you behave yourself. Don't forget to check Joe and I out this Saturday, 6 to 8 Eastern, 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. Central on the Gray Zone Uncensored. Yes, it's for real this freaking time. It's going to happen, backed by popular demand. So check it out. Make some time for us. And anyway, let's get love and light to Bubbles, get her back on track so she can get her butt back to work next week. Anyway, good night, everybody. Have a good weekend.